When Nikita Khrushchev was removed from his post as head of the Soviet government on October 14, 1964, a brief era of liberalization came to a close. While the policy initiatives of this former henchman of Stalin had created a more open, dynamic national culture, they'd also provoked discomfort among the Soviet political elite. Khrushchev's denunciations of the so-called great leader and teacher had offended as many as they'd gratified, and his political reforms, which included the release of millions of political prisoners and the relaxation of repression and censorship, had turned former allies into enemies. Moreover, his brashly threatening public manner, exemplified most dramatically at a meeting of the UN General Assembly in 1960 when he took off a shoe and pounded it on a desk in protest, had become a source of embarrassment. The humiliation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, planning failures that undermined Soviet agriculture, and an ongoing conflict with communist China over his policy of coexistence with the United States and other capitalist powers would seal his fate. In October of 1964, Khrushchev was asked to return to Moscow from his dacha on the Black Sea for an emergency session of the Politburo, its apparent purpose being a discussion of pressing economic issues. But when he arrived in the capital, he was informed that he was being ousted. At a meeting on October 13th, Khrushchev was subjected to the reading of a 29-count indictment charging him with mismanagement, incompetence, and professional arrogance. During a second session the following morning, he realized that his power base had evaporated. He agreed to retire, ostensibly for reasons of age and ill health. Khrushchev lived the final 7 years of his life under house arrest in his Moscow home, relegated to the status of a non-person whose name wasn't even mentioned by the government when they denounced him. His replacement was Leonid Brezhnev, a former protege who brought a welcome degree of stability to Soviet economic and foreign policy. But this was accomplished, in part, by curtailing many of the freedoms initiated by Khrushchev, and Brezhnev's government gradually evolved into a kind of corrupt participatory bureaucracy that reflexively frustrated attempts to adapt to changing internal and external circumstances. As the 1960s came to an end, a sense of social and economic stagnation set in, an atmosphere that would become the backdrop for Dmitri Shostakovich's final years. By 1971, Shostakovich's health had been deteriorating for more than a decade. Initial symptoms of weakness and pain in his right hand had marked the beginning of a cascade that would include serious falls, long hospital stays, chronic pain, multiple heart attacks and strokes, diagnoses of polio, ALS, and finally, lung cancer. Inevitably, this physical disintegration was accompanied by a reduction of his musical output. More significantly, the bleak despair that had always been an element in Shostakovich's music became a consistent defining presence that reflected the spirit of the time, and in this regard his 15th Symphony exemplifies this final stage of his creative evolution. He began sketching the piece in April of 1971, completing it at the end of July while spending the summer at the Soviet Composers Union retreat in Repino, a small town just outside of St. Petersburg. Although his mental faculties were as acute as they'd ever been, his trembling, painful hands made the process of putting his typically abundant ideas on paper slow and difficult, and it's likely that the sparse textures that dominate the symphony are a consequence of this struggle. The work was his first non-programmatic symphony since his 10th, a piece completed 18 years earlier, and its content has raised numerous questions regarding potential extra-musical meanings that will probably remain unanswered. Although it's hard to conclude with certainty that Shostakovich believed the 15th would be his final symphony, it's unquestionable that he saw death as a looming reality. Thus, his abundant, quasi-symbolic inclusion of musical quotations from works by other composers as well as his own suggests a final inventory of fondly recalled musical objects that establishes a truly valedictory aura. These quotes run the gamut from Rossini's William Tell to Wagner's Götterdämmerung and include references to the Ring Cycle, the opening of Tristan und Isolde, the Glinka song Do Not Tempt Me Needlessly, and the invasion theme from Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. He explained the presence of these quotes in typically enigmatic prose, saying, "I don't quite know why the quotations are there, but I could not not include them." And yet these allusions collectively constitute only the most apparent layer of musical symbolism that's embedded in this symphony. The slow, desolate laments in the second movement, the biting sarcasm of the scherzo, and the catastrophic climaxes in the second and fourth movements are in themselves references to musical gestures that had long been signatures of Shostakovich's symphonic music. Even when the musical language seems most abstract, Shostakovich deploys his combinations of horizontal and vertical elements with supreme poetic calculation. Discrete passages of 12-tone writing alternately convey chaos and anguish, while high and low-pitched tone clusters suggest an arid, toxic landscape. Perhaps the most poignant of these sonic constructions is the simulation of a ticking clock he elicits from an expanded percussion section. The effect appears briefly at the end of the scherzo and then returns in the finale's extended coda, where it floats above an open fifth held by the strings that recalls the beginning of Mahler's First Symphony. After a final spasm, the ticking fades away, the barren string chord appearing to be all that remains. Then, in a parting gesture of reconciliation, a C sharp is quietly sounded by the celeste and the glockenspiel, completing the harmony and bringing Shostakovich's symphonic legacy to a close.